We're in the KUZARI on page 313, and the last thing that we had spoken about was the parable that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had offered for why we don't focus so much on the afterlife in our prayers. Why, when we daven, we don't really have a separate prayer for what's going to happen to us after we die. We don't ask Hashem for a good portion in the world to come. That's certainly not the focus. And there is a small little portion in Uvalit Zion where we say Shenizkev v'nichyeh v'nir'eh v'nirash tova v'chol l'shnei amos ha'mashiach u'lechayei olam haba. That we ask, we hope we will be able to see the day when we have a goodly portion in the world to come. But that's like one line out of all of the prayers. And the reason that we don't focus on that was the last thing that we saw, that the Jew in exile, the Jew who is constantly yearning to have a face-to-face reconciliation with God, is already expressing a desire to have the closest connection to Hashem as possible, even more than a share in the world to come. And so that's the reason why that's not the focus of our prayers. It's not the focus of the Torah. And so that brings us to page 313, subparagraph number 7, where he says, okay, now I've finished describing what a saintly person does nowadays. I've concluded our discussion of what the chassid does, of what the pious person, how he behaves. And in the course of this conversation, what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has described in describing this pious person, this chassid, the saintly person, is a person whose whole focus is on trying to have a relationship, this conjunction, a bond with Hashem. Everything that he thinks about is all focused on what can I do to become closer to Hashem. And that's really the whole focus of his entire life. From my description, you can imagine what the saintly person was like during the flourishing period in our history, in God's own territory, and amidst the holy nation who were the elite descendants of their roots, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. If that's the person today in the diaspora who was able to maintain such a lofty level of piety, both mentally and practically in the way that he lives his life, then you can imagine what people who were pious must have been like a couple thousand years ago when they were living in Eretz Yisrael and they had a temple and they could go to Jerusalem. And he says, amidst the holy nation who were the elite descendants of the roots of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And you'll see why in just a second, why he has to hearken back to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Modesty was firmly established within men and women, and people uttered no perversities. And what he means to say by that, this goes back to looking back into the lives of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the Imahot as well. Because how do I know that people were very modest? Because all we have to do is look back on the lives of the Avot and the Imahot, and we see how modest they were. Just some examples. When Avraham was traveling with Sarah, there's a famine, and they're traveling down to Egypt. Avram turns to Sarah one day and he says, Hineina yadati ki isha yafat mar'e'at. You know, I just realized you're a very attractive woman. They'd been married for decades. I just realized that you're attractive. Now, that's a sign of modesty. That's a sign of extreme modesty, that he didn't really know what Sarah looked like until he made an effort to look at her. But that should bother you. That story should bother you, because not only should it bother you because didn't Avram ever look into his wife's eyes, into his wife's face? Well, The answer is that, well, maybe that's a sign of modesty. You don't look at the bride. That's one possibility. But what's also possible, and by the way, this seems to contradict the Gemara. The Gemara says that a man must look upon his bride before he marries her. You can't marry a woman without seeing what she looks like. Why? Because if you meet her for the first time under the chuppah, then what could potentially happen? She's not going to be attractive. And a marriage has to be predicated upon chemistry. There has to be chemistry between the couple. So how do we reconcile that with Avram saying to Sarah, I now realize that you're an attractive woman? So if we look carefully at the story in the Talmud, the story is that they were both bending down at a lake to either drink water or to wash their face. And it says in the Gemara in Bava Batra that Avram looked at Sarah's reflection and said, oh, that's you, Sarah. I just realized you're so attractive. Why does the Gemara relate the story in that way? It relates the story in that way because when you look at someone's face, you see a beauty that is far more than skin deep. When Avram saw Sarah, he was not looking at her external beauty. He was looking at the righteous woman that was the source of attraction to him because of her piety. That's what is meant by modesty. Modesty is not that I don't look upon my wife, but that when I look upon her, I'm looking upon not her beauty, but I'm looking upon her chen, the comeliness that is a product of her righteousness, not a product of the shape of her nose or her eyes and so forth. What Avram had looked in Sarah's eyes millions of times, but he never saw her external beauty. He only saw her internal beauty. And so that's why the Gemara story is that as they're traveling down to Egypt, Avram sees a reflection of Sarah in a pool. When you see a picture of someone or a reflection of someone, you don't get to see that special internal beauty that you see when you see someone face to face. And that's the reason why he said, oh, even from a superficial perspective, you actually happen to be a very beautiful woman. And that's the reason why we need to be concerned that if we're going to go down to Egypt, maybe one of the inhabitants of Egypt is going to want to marry you and will try to kill me. So we have to come up with a plan as how we can delay anyone from trying to take you as their wife. And that's how he came up with this scheme he told Sarah, tell people that I'm your brother and that will take down their name, anyone who would like to act as your suitor. Usually it's the brother who takes down the name and handles his sister's affairs. And, that at least in that way, we'll be able to fend off any suitors that will want to try and marry you. And they won't kill me that way. So that was his whole plan. But that was the reason why. But that's the modesty that is being referred to over here. Modesty is not looking upon your spouse. Modesty is looking upon your spouse with that third eye, the eye of seeing the deeper beauty within the person, not the external beauty. Okay? And by the way, if I could give social commentary for one moment, that's the problem with these shidduch resumes today, where everyone wants a picture of the girl, right? What's the problem? Is that you have a picture of a girl, and you don't see her internal beauty. There's no way to make a determination how beautiful this young lady is just by a photograph, because it doesn't show what really the aura that shines off her face when you meet her in person. And it's created serious problems. I don't know what the solution is, but that's just an interesting aside. So modesty that's one example of tzniut. It says about Sarah, Ayeh Sarah ishtecha, the angel said when they visited Avram, where is Sarah your wife? Vayomer hinei va'ohel. He said, she's in the tent. My wife is very, very modest. She doesn't parade around when we have guests. She was in the tent. Again, another example of Sarah's tzniut. about Rivka, when Rivka first meets Yitzchak out in the field. Eliezer brings her back. It says, "Vatikachat saif vatitkas." She immediately covered herself with a blanket in order to be able to be modest in Yitzchak's presence. The tzniut, the Gemara says, it was because of Rachel's tzniut that she merited to have a descendant by the name of King Saul, who was extremely humble and modest. What was Rachel's tzniut? She had kept the secret sign that Yaakov had given to her, because she told Yaakov, "My father's going to try and swap my sister Leah for me." So they made up a special secret sign for him to know that it was really Rachel and not Leah. But when Rachel saw that this could mean tremendous humiliation for her sister Leah, she gave the signs to Leah. But that was her own modesty. It was her own sense of humility, not wanting to harm another person, not wanting her sister Leah to be harmed. So that's the type of modesty that is being referred to over here. And people uttered no perversities. The prophet Zephaniah says, She'erit Yisrael lo ya'asu avla v'lo yadabru chazav v'lo yimtzu b'fihem lashon tarmit, that the remnant of Israel will do no perversity, will not speak falsely, and will not say anything that is deceitful. The saintly person among them purified himself and did not allow his soul to be fouled by any profanities that he might hear from others. Today, just to show you how far we are from that world of the temple, where people uttered no profanities, didn't even hear profanities. Here, it's ubiquitous. You can't turn on a radio or listen to a song in the media without hearing profanities. I mean, it's crazy, the level that we've descended to. Yes?
I don't think any discussion of modesty could be complete without talking about social media and the lack of modesty that even from people portray. And I'm not just talking about modesty in how they look. I'm talking about the fact that people find it necessary to flaunt every aspect of their lives in front of the entire world.
Right.
Meaning, look how gorgeous I am. Look how gorgeous my husband and I are. Look how gorgeous we are with our 5 kids. Look at us on vacation on the beach. Aren't we amazing? And this
is what I had for dinner.
And this is what I made for dinner. Look how gorgeous it is. And look at our business. And look at this. And look at that. Aside from the fact that it's all false, it's so unseemly. Do you have to flaunt everything in front of the whole world? Where is your modesty? Keep some things private. Aside from the fact that we know that bracha doesn't rest on things that are made so public, why are you doing this? No. To what end? I feel like it's so antithetical to everything that we stand for.
It is. And the reason people do it is because they, I don't know if it's true for everyone, but many people post their lives on social media because they don't have anyone else of significance to share it with. So they want the whole world to know about it in the hopes that that'll preserve it in some way. It comes from an insecurity, I think.
But everybody's doing it. It can't be only people who don't have what to share with, who to share with. Everybody does it. And the fact that everyone, their closest 20 friends have to comment, gorgeous, 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 what is this? And it's not only that, I see women who hold themselves up to be educators and leaders in the frum community posting private aspects of their lives that I don't think is appropriate. You want to show pictures of your daughter with her grandmother before she walked down the aisle, and the whole world has to see that and what the grandmother said to the granddaughter? Is nothing private anymore? I just don't get it.
Yeah. Point is well taken. Linda?
I just want to make a comment about that. I think it also is a big problem, not only because of that, but what I have read is that especially for young people when they do it, it's actually a big cause of anxiety, depression, and problems in youth, because they look at other people's lives and they assume, like, you only see the good, right? So people start to look at their own life and they say, like, I have a miserable lot in life, like, I don't live this kind of life, and it's false, and it really, I mean, they've done studies where it really causes a lot of problems in people's psyche because of what they think is true, which is an imaginary, it's dangerous.
Yeah. Okay, so we've come very, very far from the type of modesty that is described in the times of the temple. Impurity from bodily emissions or from impure creatures, the dead, leprosy, and so on, was not found on his person or his clothes, because the people attached themselves to holiness and purity. People would be very careful, even when they were engaging in conversations, if they knew that someone might be ritually impure, they wouldn't engage with them in a conversation on the street, because maybe some of your spittle will come out of your mouth and come onto my garment and render me impure. People were very, very meticulous in these kinds of laws. And so you can imagine the type of mindset that people had about remaining pure. The purity of bodily tumah, of bodily impurity, is really just a manifestation of the consciousness level that people had to maintain holiness within their communities. This was even more acute for someone who lived in Jerusalem, the city of the divine presence. Such a person would mingle only with those groups of people who were very holy, the Kohanim, the Levites, Nazarites, sages, judges, and officers. He would witness the people celebrating the festivals with songs of joy and thanks 3 times a year. He heard only the songs of God, and saw only the work of God. He wasn't listening to hip-hop, right? He saw only the songs of God. And even more so, if he was a Kohen or Levite, he subsisted on the bread of God and stood in the house of God from childhood, just like Shmuel. He had no need for a livelihood, and instead immersed himself in the service of God throughout his whole life. He says, what is your opinion of such a person's behavior and his purity of soul and perfection of deeds? The KUZARI says, of course, this is the ultimate level. The only thing higher is the level of angels. One who was so well equipped could rightfully hope to achieve prophecy, especially because of the habitation of the divine presence. The type of service you have described did not require any additional asceticism or abstinence. In other words, if a person lives their life according to halakha and according to a standard of purity, then they don't need to think about what else can I do to be stringent and to deprive myself of physical indulgence. Living the halachic life, going to the temple every day, going to the shul every day, living in a period of great modesty, of great humility, of great purity. You don't need anything else. And you read about this and you sort of say to yourself, it's too bad that, in many ways, it's too bad that we don't have those kinds of things. I remember speaking with someone about this very thing. You sort of ask yourself a question. You don't have it so much here, but when you grew up in Los Angeles, the billboards in LA are pretty jarring sometimes. If you ever drive down Sunset Boulevard, you see every street has another billboard. And it's usually about something Hollywood-oriented in the entertainment industry, or Guess jeans, or some model. And so growing up in LA, you sort of become inured, immune to those kinds of images. So on the one hand, when you're overexposed to this kind of the lack of modesty, you lose a sensitivity to it. So on the one hand, there's a benefit, which is the benefit being is that you're not going to become provoked or excited or titillated by a billboard because you see it all the time. But on the other hand, it certainly is reflective of the fact that we've become sort of calloused on the inside in our souls from certain things. And that's the reality. We don't even feel a sense of tum'ah anymore because we are so far from it. But in those days, in the days that he's describing, people's level of elevation was so high that people would be able to feel a sense of pain. They would wince if they would see something or hear something, hear Lashon Hara, hear something untoward. That was the kind of life that people had back then. Okay. This is the natural place to hold it. Go ahead, Linda.
Sorry, I'm almost afraid to ask you this question, but do you not think that maybe the image that is created of people being so moral and everything in biblical times is actually accurate? I mean, so my question, for example, is you're giving an example of Rachel and Leah. So do you think, for example, it was right to switch daughters? Was that a moral thing to do?
It was totally immoral. Lavan was totally an immoral person. He tried to justify it afterwards with expressing his piety. Oh, we could never do that. We could never give the younger daughter before the older daughter to get married. But to deceive Yaakov, he had no problem with. So it was completely immoral what he did. The question really is on Rachel. She was complicit on some level, according to the Talmud, because she knew how to inform Yaakov. She could have informed Yaakov that he was getting the switcheroo, but she didn't, because she wanted to protect her sister. It's a little bit hard to understand how Yaakov could have trusted Rachel after that, but apparently he saw within her his bashert, and he had to learn how to move on beyond that.